no one is saying that this past week has not been a disaster for the country and for Biden. And you see articles now in the New York Times, for example. You see people on CNN saying, how could this happen? What's wrong with Blinken and Sullivan? You have the intelligence community, which generally speaking in this country is left of center, actually, coming out now and saying, wait a minute, don't blame us. And the question would be whether this continues. And I actually think it will for one reason.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. Cheers very much for joining us. If you enjoy this interview, please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell and supporting the channel via the link in the description. On today's show, we speak about the fact that the House of Commons is debating the UK government's decision to pull out of Afghanistan and the decision to take 20,000 Afghan refugees. Much has been said over recent days from those without the expertise of today's guests. He has a pretty unique insight, who I'm sure will be able to shine some pretty rare light on just what's happened, and crucially for me, what's going to happen now for us today. Elliott Abrams is Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor in the administration of President George W. Bush, where he supervised US policy in the Middle East for the White House. And he served as Special Representative for Iran and Venezuela in the administration of Donald Trump. So this is a bloke who really knows what he's talking about. Elliot, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good morning.
Now, Elliot, can we start, I wonder, by going back to the last administration and the Taliban Agreement that was signed under Trump? Is Biden right to imply that this agreement set in motion, cast iron, all that's happened since then?
I'd say he's right to say set in motion, but not in cast iron. I'm just looking at the agreement, and it is very clear that it's the Trump agreement, that it is conditions based, that the United States does nothing unless the Taliban have actually complied with what they said they would. There's a certain irony here, which is that Biden has come in and reversed everything that Trump did, rightly or wrongly. And all of a sudden on this one, he says, oh no, I can't touch it. This one is cast iron. So I think it's disingenuous of him to say he had absolutely no options.
And how did the Biden administration's intelligence get all of this so very wrong? That's another point I think that commentators keep going back to, where you've got Biden in July saying it's going to be absolutely fine, folks. The Afghan military can handle it from here. Don't you worry. There won't be scenes similar to Saigon where we've got helicopters coming down to pick up American staff members from an embassy and get them out of the country. But we saw just that. We saw just that. How did the intelligence get it so wrong? Or did it even?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's what happened, actually. That is, of course, what Biden is saying. But now, as you'd expect, you're getting lots of leaks from the intelligence community saying, wait a minute. We never told him exactly what he is saying. And what you're seeing in the newspapers in the US today, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, is leaks from CIA saying we predicted a quick collapse if the United States withdrew completely and in short order. So they are now defending themselves and saying that Biden and his crew, well, I shouldn't say his crew, they're now saying Biden simply didn't listen. There's pretty good evidence that the US military leadership urged him to keep the very small number of troops we had. We had about 3,000, and others, NATO and other countries, had another roughly 7,000, 8,000. He wouldn't do it. His top staff people apparently also did not agree with this, but they saw where their boss was, so they stopped fighting it.
Yeah, which is pretty damning because that's not what we're hearing now, right? There's this
Yeah.
idea. Biden, in his speech the other day, he blamed two people, I think, and correct me if you think I'm wrong: the Afghan military and Donald J. Trump.
I think it's exactly right. I think the part of it that was the worst was to say the problem is the Afghans won't fight. We lost just under 2,500 killed, we, the United States, in Afghanistan. The number of Afghan soldiers killed is about 50,000. So the notion that, the Afghans would never fight, I think, is really quite unfair.
I've always thought that was an odd thing to say about a country that fought off the Russians as well. It's an odd, the idea that these people can't fight.
Right. I mean, we all have long experience. There's a famous Harold Macmillan quote, being asked, "What's the first thing you have to do?" As prime minister, he said, "Don't invade Afghanistan." So we all have long experience with this, and it's always been an unhappy experience. But to turn around after much advice that said, "Don't leave in a week," and say, "Yeah, the problem is the damn Afghans." What does this say to people who are U.S. allies around the world? From Taiwanese to Estonians to Israelis. I mean, it's quite a message.
It is. And just how much do you think that statement, that press conference he gave, well, you can't really call it a press conference because he didn't take any questions, but the Taiwanese, for example, they must be, and if you pardon my French, they must be shitting themselves right now. They must be terrified, thinking, oh my goodness, were the Chinese emboldened by the West's decision here, the West's perceived cowardice, according to the Russians and the Chinese, they must feel absolutely alone on the world stage right now.
I worry about that a lot, and I would hope that the Biden administration would understand that, and that therefore over the next few months they would do something, not say something. They would do something, whether it's beefing up support for Taiwan or its action against Iran, something that gives a sense that Biden had a particular view of Afghanistan, but it doesn't convey to all of these other problems. It's a real worry, though. I think one of the things, last Friday was the anniversary of the so-called Abraham Accords, Israel and the Arab states. And I would think from the Arab point of view, for example, they would be very pleased with what they had done. Because they can, frankly, it looks as if they can rely more on the Israelis and each other than they can on the U.S.
Yeah, which is pretty damning, isn't it? Now, what do you think Trump would have done by now? If I can ask you to sort of get your crystal ball out and imagine that 2020 had gone a totally different way and President Trump was re-elected for a second term, do you think Trump would have gone back on a break to Camp David by now?
Well, that's the first, that's a very odd thing, isn't it? I mean, in the middle of this crisis, Biden was at Camp David. He flies in to do his speech, takes no questions. Then he goes back to Camp David. Then the staff is asked, how many leaders around the world has he spoken to? And the answer is, none. So then he gets on the phone to Boris Johnson, just so that they don't have to answer none anymore. It's a bizarre performance. Look, what would Trump have done? The honest answer is Trump was so completely unpredictable that you'd just be guessing. My guess would be that when there was a lot of military advice and some intelligence saying, hey, look, this is going to be a disaster. It's going to be like Saigon. You don't want this to happen to you. He probably would have stepped back.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, because optics were everything to Trump. He's a real showman. But I guess the question that provokes for me. There's this idea, as you say, that President Trump was a very unpredictable president. He was a president that did diplomacy by Twitter. But that seemed to actually reap some dividends. That seemed to reap some rewards, because the likes of Iran, the likes of the Chinese, the likes of the North Koreans even, they had no idea what Trump was going to do next, what Trump was going to say next. And that unpredictable, I guess, nature of that American president had the world on tenterhooks. It was sort of waiting with bated breath and too scared to really do anything. Whereas now you see that Iran, according to the United Nations watchdog, is going ahead with weapons-grade nuclear. It's building that nuclear weapon. And then the Chinese, of course, through their state media, are putting out some pretty horrific statements on what this means for Taiwan. Would that have happened under the unpredictability of President Trump? You sort of get the impression that doddering old Biden isn't going to intervene anywhere. He is, despite what they called President Trump, an America First president, a non-interventionist president, an isolationist president. Do you think that's right?
I think it is. You know, Nixon used this idea of unpredictability as a strategy. For Trump, I think it wasn't a strategy. It was just the way he was, but it worked. And remember, if he'd been there, the Taliban would have been dealing with the guy who ordered the killing of Soleimani. Whereas in the case of Biden, who in that speech said, we took out bin Laden, failed to remind people that he was opposed to taking out bin Laden. He told Obama, don't do it. So it's a very different person. And I think that the Soleimani event, the killing of Soleimani, plus the general unpredictability that you mentioned, would have left the Taliban wondering, maybe we should be very careful here. It's quite a different picture, I think.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, President Trump's aborted plan, if you remember, to host peace talks between Afghanistan's elected leader and representatives of the Taliban at Camp David, funnily enough, it didn't go ahead, it's safe to say. And I believe that's because the Taliban had attacked a convoy at Kabul or something. It's something along those lines. But some have argued that this would have legitimized the Taliban, and that would have been a horrible thing to do. But I just want to get your opinion on whether or not you think that that has de facto now happened. Because given that social media networks, like Twitter, allow them to have an account on these platforms, but not the former American president, given that the Taliban have had spokespeople all over broadcast networks over recent days on both sides of the pond, I've seen them here in the UK and over in the States as well, given that leaders such as the Prime Minister of New Zealand have naively called for the new regime to respect human rights. I don't know what world she is living on, but it's not the one I'm occupying. Do you think the West have now legitimized the Taliban as the de facto heads of state in that country?
I think we have, or are very close to recognizing them as the de facto rulers. Legitimizing is further than I'd go because their behavior, I think, is going to save us from that. We saw this morning in Jalalabad, there was a protest demonstration and the Taliban fired into the crowd, killing people. And I think their behavior with respect to protests, with respect to women and girls, with respect to people who worked for the previous government, is soon going to make it impossible to continue to legitimize them. So I think their own brutality will save us from that final step. But you mentioned the Camp David thing. I mean, I actually think that Trump would have been talked out of that. A similar thing was Biden's decision that we would finally get out on 9/11. I mean, how could he possibly not realize what the symbolism of that would be? But that's now gone by the way as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that sort of thing, you do just wonder, out of a country of 300 million and odd people, those two people were selected as leaders of the free world. It is an incredible thing. But anyway, a former Conservative member of Parliament here in the UK actually called on the West, and he is a man who knows Afghanistan quite well. Rory Stewart is his name.
Oh, yes.
And he has called for the West to take millions of asylum seekers. Does the West, in your view, now have a duty to take in millions of those fleeing the Taliban? You've seen the scenes yourself of people grasping on to planes leaving the Kabul airstrip, holding on for dicing with death, because that is preferable to staying under a Taliban regime. Does the West have a duty, despite the fact that I imagine there are significant security implications with, for example, those who've infiltrated these asylum seeker camps from the Taliban or wherever else, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, you name it? Does the West have a duty? And if it does, are you concerned about said duty?
I think I do know Rory Stewart, and I've read the book that he once wrote about walking across Afghanistan. I think he's wrong here, though it's a very hard thing to say. I think we have a moral obligation to the people who worked with us. That's something like, for the US, it's something like 20,000 people plus their families. Gets you probably to 100,000. We have an absolute obligation to them, and probably to many others who worked with other countries, with Britain, with France, with others who were part of the International Security Assistance Force, with former officials of the government. I don't think I'd say that we have an obligation to take every single Afghan who wants to leave the country, because where does that stop? Do we have an obligation to take every single Yemeni, every single Syrian? I mean, do we have an obligation to take every single Pakistani who's not a Muslim, who's a Christian, for example, or another minority? So I don't think I'd say 35 million Afghans have a right to live in the West, but those who had any relationship with us and therefore are at special risk, I think we have a complete obligation.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And actually, I think the public would agree with that. You know, those who were interpreters, for example, that actually allowed the British forces, the American forces, the French forces to communicate with people that they otherwise would have been completely precluded from doing so. I agree. But I am worried about what it means. For example, there were plans floated in this country to say that, you can basically turn up, say you're from Afghanistan, and we will take care of you. I mean, when I know the Americans have a problem at the south as well, at the southern border. Mm-hmm. We have a problem at our southern border, despite the fact we're an island. We've got a problem with boats coming over from France at the English Channel, where people, in my view, are now going to be able to turn up and say, well, I'm from Afghanistan. I don't have any documentation. Let me in. And we will then naively, I think, say, okay, very well, there we are. And I'm afraid to say, and this is a horrible thing, I know, to address, but I think it is important in the context of this conversation, to actually say there have been some that have come from Afghanistan in the past who have committed horrible atrocities in the West. And my fear is that a sort of the West feeling guilty for having absolved itself of responsibility in Afghanistan, in bringing people over to either America or Britain in large numbers, it's just a recipe for disaster, surely.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen, actually. I mean, it's hard to read public opinion in the U.S. We do know that Approval of Biden is falling. Approval of what he's doing in Afghanistan is falling. I do believe that if you ask, do we have an obligation, say, to interpreters who work with American troops? People would say yes, partly because if you turn on American TV now, you're seeing many veterans of the Army talking about this question. But I think if you asked, well, how about beyond that? Do we have an obligation to take in millions of Afghans? I'm pretty certain that Americans would say, wait a minute, that goes too far.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder then, you mentioned Biden's polling there taking a hit because of this.
Yeah.
Do you, Elliot, do you believe that the American media, and I mean by the American media, even the left, I'm not talking about Fox News, I'm not talking about other organizations. Do you think news networks have actually started to ask questions beyond, oh, how does it feel to bring back a dog to the White House, for example? Really quite, I think, vacuous questions and not holding the president of the free world to any real accountability or scrutiny. Now that seems, and forgive me if this is somewhat naive because I'm not American, but that seems to have switched over recent days. They seem to have finally switched on to saying, we need to scrutinize what this guy's up to.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a very important point. He was getting clear sailing, as you say. There were a few reporters who would be challenging, but not many. No one is saying that this past week has not been a disaster for the country and for Biden. And you see articles now in the New York Times, for example. You see people on CNN saying, how could this happen? What's wrong with Blinken and Sullivan? You have the intelligence community, which generally speaking in this country is left of center, actually, coming out now and saying, wait a minute, don't blame us. And the question would be whether this continues. And I actually think it will for one reason. The White House thinks, it appears the president thinks that, it's 14 months to the next elections, 15 months. By then Afghanistan will be forgotten. That may be true, but what won't be forgotten is incompetence. What won't be forgotten is this picture of disarray. I don't think you're going to see all of those reporters go back to treating, let us say, Blinken and Sullivan as just, infinitely greater people than their predecessors. And this is particularly tough for Biden because of his age. I think you're going to see now an undercurrent of questioning, how is he? Is he on top of this job? What was he doing at Camp David? There hasn't been much questioning of Biden's fitness. And candidly, I think that going forward, there will be more. And I think Democrats are really going to be worried more now about the midterm election, because our midterm elections are always a referendum on the incumbent. And boy, if they were held today, the Democrats would clearly lose the House, might lose the Senate. So and the problem is, the vice president is really not terribly popular either.
Yes. I mean, I was going to say, God help America if Biden does resign and Kamala Harris is elected president. Not even elected, is made president.
Yeah. I think that's not in the cards. But what is in the cards, I think, is what you're saying. That is, the media took a dive for Biden because of Trump, because of their hatred of Trump. And they stayed, if you will, underwater until now. And so there is some hope now that they will return to, doing their jobs when it comes to the Biden administration.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you mentioned the New York Times there. There was a sort of weird parallel between here and the States, in which here you had the New York Times waxing lyrical about Brexit, how terrible this was, what an act of self-harm this was for the UK, how silly of it to want to manage its own affairs. And then you've got the Trump derangement syndrome by them as well. There seems to have been this just collective breakdown. And that explains why I think Biden has been up to this point to get away with so much, because at least he wasn't the big bad orange man. That has been the sort of the narrative, I think.
Yeah.
And it is deranged. It is terrible, I think, for democracy and for accountability and all of those really important, crucial things that are the cornerstone of any functioning liberal democracy.
I think you're right. And I think that this Afghanistan question undermines so much now about what the media was thinking and about the Trump administration. And one you've just mentioned when you say Brexit, one of the things that the media was saying when they were saying, thank God we're done with Trump, was the way this idiot offended our allies and deprecated our alliances. Okay. And there you have Biden saying, no, I'm a NATO guy. Well, look at the way he treated the UK and every other ally. Every other ally. Because remember, Afghanistan was at one point the popular war. And there were dozens of countries that sent troops. He basically treated this as if no one else mattered except Joe Biden and the United States. And again, if you read the New York Times, if you read the Washington Post, they're saying that now. So I think in a way, this is a corner that has been turned. I don't think they can come back from it.
We sort of touched on the security implications with asylum seekers. Do you think there are security implications for the West generally now? Do you think that actually Afghanistan will become a safe haven for obviously the Taliban, but for Al-Qaeda, for ISIS, for other groups, and actually those sort of activities might well be covered by, I don't know, the Russians, the Chinese, who surely should fear themselves any retribution from these kind of really awful terrorist organizations?
It's logical that that will happen unless the Taliban wants to prevent it. For every jihadi now, this is a great victory, and Afghanistan is this week the capital of the world. So they will try, I think, to go there and to use Afghan space. What would stop it would be the Taliban really saying, no, we're not having any of that. We promised everyone. Now, how likely is that? I mean, it seems to me it's very unlikely. You look at Iran next door. Iran has allowed Al-Qaeda, for example, to use Iranian space for years now under certain conditions, but they've been there. So I think it's reasonable to believe that the Taliban will say to these groups, just keep your heads down. But I don't think it's reasonable to think that they're going to fully exclude them from Afghanistan and try to police those borders completely. Every intelligence agency, I think, realizes this is a risk with which we now have to deal.
Yeah. And the idea as well that they're going to be, that they've put out statements, their spokespeople have put out statements saying, by the way, that in itself sounds bizarre. The fact that I am saying a spokesperson for the Taliban has said X. But a spokesperson for the Taliban...
You can use the term spokesman, by the way, not spokesperson.
Spokesperson, yes, spokesman, yes. I'm not trying to be woke, I promise. They're basically saying women and girls, treatment of them will be more liberal than we expect here in the West. And you just sort of think, yeah, okay, I'm not buying it.
In accordance with, everyone will be treated fairly in accordance with Sharia. And we know what their interpretation of Sharia law is and what the role of women is, according to them. So as we see Afghan women on TV saying, they dread the future because they think it's going to look like the past. We've seen nothing in the behavior of the Taliban that suggests that they've become woke in the last few decades.
Yeah, well, quite. I mean, yeah, it's not going to be long though, is it, before Biden starts asking them for mask mandates and for their pronouns. But anyway, I wonder, Elliot, to end, because I know you're a busy man and you've got to be off, but what does this mean for foreign policy moving forward? Because obviously the days of interventionism are surely now a relic of the past, because we've discovered that the United Kingdom, for example, simply won't do anything without the support of the United States of America. So are we destined to become a world which is a lot less likely to engage with the issues on the international stage?
It's a good question. I hope not. I think that in an odd way, what's happening in Afghanistan, though it is being used by isolationists to say, you see what happens when you intervene, will be used, frankly, by mainstream Republicans and some mainstream Democrats to say, no, this is what happens when you don't intervene. This is what happens when you look away and you refuse to take responsibility. It may even teach Biden a lesson, although he does seem to be quite impervious. So I think it's very hard to predict the impact. I mean, if we go back a ways, I do remember after Vietnam, people said, well, now that's the last time the United States has any kind of international role or intervention for decades. But then a few years later came Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election. So I think it would be wrong to give up and say, well, the United States is never going to intervene anywhere. The first test may well come in the next year or two in Iran, because we do see the Iranians moving closer and closer to a nuclear weapon. I think your question is a very fair one, but I think you'll see a resistance grow in the United States, and not just in the Republican Party, to having our country walk away from its responsibilities.
Very interesting point. Elliot, thank you very much for giving up your time to speak to me today. I thought that was an absolutely fascinating
My pleasure.
insight. Thank you. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.